I'm a Chamar and you're a Brahmin, how will we travel together? And interestingly, the answer comes from this French woman masquerading as an Indian, and she says, it's like on a boat of pilgrims. Interestingly, the journey is likened to a pilgrimage. On a boat of pilgrims, no one can use caste and everyone is the same. It's like taking a boat to the temple of Jagannath. And this is coming from a French woman, mind you. From now on and forever afterwards, we shall all be ship siblings, Jahaj Bhais and Jahaj Bahens, which means ship brothers and ship sisters. Now the paper talks about the Opium Wars, it talks about the first early settlement in Mauritius and how it happens apart from the textual reading. Now the part which I wish to share with you, I'm not going into the textual reading and any of the other things, is this whole business of theorizing of the diaspora and why I chose to work on this. Now one of the very pertinent questions that I would ask myself is, after so many years of post-globalization and such like, why is Amitabh Ghosh tracing the first journey of the Girmitias into Mauritius? What is the purpose of this? The book of course is very interesting and all that apart, and it's part of a trilogy. So the second part is also out, River of Smoke. Now one of the answers that I have given myself, and maybe you can help me find more answers, is because Ghosh has a theory on nationalism, which I think in a way takes from what Tagore was talking about, that we should be ideally a land of no nations. Let us not create nations, let us not make these boundaries. So one of the things I think that Ghosh is trying to emphasize here is that, how were these cultures formulated? It was this motley group which went there, and a certain culture grew out of their interactions together. So when today we talk about things like Indian culture, and this does not happen in my culture, I would like to take all that with a pinch of salt and like to think about it. Because cultures grow, cultures are grown, cultures are not watertight, and they sort of don't remain watertight. And also this, what our friends were talking about, and very correctly, how the so-called Indian culture is sold to the West, I think that really needs to be problematized, because that pop culture is sort of sold, which really has very little to do with the quote-unquote Indian culture, if we have an Indian culture. So this whole business of the Mauritius is actually created. So a whole bunch of people go there, and what happens? Now this business about the name that I was talking about, Diti, this village woman, runs away. She has an opium addict for a husband. When the husband dies, the brother-in-law tries to take advantage, so Diti is forced to run away. She runs away with whom? She runs away with this Chamar man who comes to her help. And together they run away, and then they don't know where to go, so they sign in as indentured labor. When they're doing that, they're asked their names. And all the time it is Diti who does all the answering. The poor Chamar man doesn't quite know what to say. So she says, we are married, and then she says, we are Chamars, and then she says, and when asked his name, she says Madhu Kalua or something like that, which the British gentleman is not able to understand, so he writes Madhu Kolver. And interestingly, the dynasty which starts in Mauritius is the Madhu Kolver dynasty. So how far have we moved from Madhu Kalua, the Chamar, to Madhu Kolver, a dynasty which is formed entirely on a name which has no similarity whatsoever with its origins. Now this whole business of the trauma that we are constantly talking about, of course the Girmitias faced a lot of trauma. The trauma of poverty, the trauma of this horrifying thought of having to cross the Kalapani, of having to go and do something which would make them outcasts. So that trauma was very definitely there. But interestingly, when you read more and more into this so-called trauma of the diaspora, you realize that the crying and the agitating happens when the Kalapani is being crossed. Once the Kalapani is crossed, they feel that their caste has gone anyway. So it's gone. Now what's the point in crying about it? So let's try and build new lives. So there is a sense of putting the threads together to start a new life. So while the trauma does exist and existed, and the hearkening back to the homeland, and most of these people know they can never come back to the homeland. The ties have been severed permanently. So it's a taking forward, not a looking backward, which I find very interesting as a thrust in this novel. The identity business I did talk about. The trauma I did talk about. Okay, then this creating of the so-called rituals and so on. Now there is this incident of a marriage and how a marriage is solemnized between two people, and BP tries very hard to light a fire within the ship because a fire has to be there, and finally for lack of a fire they have a candle. And then eventually that becomes the norm. So, constantly this whole business I find particularly interesting, and you have these examples galore in Mauritius. The early Girmitiyas poured some Ganga Jal into a talab, and it became Ganga Talab. And the Ganga Talab's water is used. So this is harkening back, and yet not quite wanting to come back to India, because the land happens to be theirs and the land they inhabit is Mauritius. So this bit I find particularly very interesting. The connect remains with the Bollywood, but the real desire to come back to India, no. Because this is their land, and these are the customs that have been formulated, and this is what is being carried forward. Then, is it done?
Yeah.
Okay. I'll just take 2 more minutes to just do a conclusion.
1 minute.
Okay, I would have liked to talk about the orality and the Videsiya cult, but I'm not going there. And I'll end with, I think, a Bhojpuri song. I didn't realize I was being asked to stop. I'll end with a Bhojpuri song. Now, these are relics which remain. You know, even when people have gone away, the songs kind of remain, and you'll find a lot of material of the diaspora studies from the orality of cultures. So, I'll end with the song, Majdhar mein hai bera mera, kripa kar asrai hai tera, which means, my raft is adrift in the current, your mercy is my only refuge. So, as the Girmitiyas cross the Kala Pani, that is the refrain that they keep singing along with the Hanuman Chalisa to tide over. But once they are there, it's that resilience of human beings which come back, and the new world needs to be created. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Nandini. We have a colleague here from Caribbean, and I'm wondering whether they agree that there are invariably comparisons with Nepal's House for Biswas. The next presentation is Dr. Anshu Pandey, and she's looking at Kiran Desai's Inheritance of Loss.
Good afternoon to all of you. The title of my paper is Diasporic Fusion in Kiran Desai's The Inheritance of the Lost. Globalization has put forward new ideas and patterns of migration had proved to be a significant force of the last 2 decades. Consequently, the question of diaspora gets new direction with particular force. The relationship between place and identity, persona and profession, and the ways culture, traditions, languages and literature interact. Writers of Indian diaspora such as Sir V.S. Naipaul, Salman Rushdie, Bharti Mukherjee, Chukba Lahiri, A.K. Ramanujan, Vikram Seth and Kiran Desai have created waves in the waves and roads and their impact of Indian literary scene. These migrant diasporas and their descendants experience displacement, fragmentation, marginalization and discontinuity in cultural discourses of the subject countries. They also face cultural dilemma when their cultural practices are mocked at and there is a threat to their cultural identity. Kiran Desai, third Indian winner of Man Booker Prize, has given a splendid novel, The Inheritance of the Lost. The Inheritance of the Lost presents the struggle and conflicts of inhabitants surviving in different countries. Kiran Desai began an Indian has used her own experience and diasporic sensibility. The mental condition of the displaced immigrants has caught the imagination of several novelists. Stephen Gills has rightly remarked, diaspora essentially is a bitter experience of desolations that leads to alienation, a scene of loss and nostalgic desire. It refers to that particular class of immigrants. It refers to that particular classes of immigrants who are able to go back usually. Usually diasporans are not happy anywhere and suffers silently. Kiran Desai has tried to depict the real picture of India. The whole novel reveals her keen interest in nature and love for India as it opens with the description of arresting beauty of the Himalayas. Her description of nature in this novel is highly poetic and realistic. The plot of the novel sets in the valleys of Himalayas, Kalimpong. She has presented parallel development in changing seasons and in the incident of violence. Quote, the incident of horror goes through the changing of the season, through winter and the flooding, spring, summer, then rain and winter again. Roads were closed, there was curfew every night and Kalimpong was trapped in its own madness. You couldn't leave the hillsides, nobody even left their house if they could help it but stayed locked in the barricaded, unquote. The novel explores colonial neurosis, multiculturalism, modernity, bitter experience, insurgency and the game of possession, gender bias and social discrimination, changing human relation and historical relationships between people from different cultures and backgrounds. Kiran Desai is the youngest woman ever to win the prestigious literary awards, the Man Booker Prize of 2006 for The Inheritance of the Lost. Ardhanti Roy, The God of Small Things, won it in 1997, and Sharman Rushdie, Midnight Children, won the same prize in 1981. Kiran Desai has presented a globalized India in her novel. Kiran Desai's India is an imagined country. Vinny says, quote, "A nation's tragedies, great and small, are revealed through the hopes and the dreams, the innocence and the arrogance, the love betrayed and all." Kiran Desai's right to post-colonial India of its poor as well as its privileged with a cold eye and warm heart. Back cover of the novel The Inheritance of the Lost. The setting of the novel is Kalimpong in the Darjeeling Hills. The novel portrays the Indian society as poverty-stricken, moreover illiteracy, unemployment, cultural conflict, cultural religion, multiplicity of language in which the novelist is deeply interested. Kiran Desai has adopted humanistic approach in her novel for epitome Jenu, Sai, Gyan, Biju and so many characters. They are all helpless and suffering from inferiority complex. Desai has treated these characters in a very humanistic way. The novel is a brilliant study of Indian culture, relations, customs, values, cultural slavery directly manifested through these characters. They dare to assimilate new culture and give up original culture in totality. The protagonist of the novel is a retired judge Jemubhai Patel, an isolated person who lives with his old cook Pannalal and a dog. When he was young, he went to England for higher studies. Jemu originally belongs to Piphitt, goes to Cambridge for higher studies. Selected in ICS, becomes a judge. He sacrifices native values. He even changed the name of his wife Bela to Nimi. Several insulting incidents happened with him in England. He had to suffer the typical isolation in abroad. When he was very far from his homeland, he suffers from neurotic anxiety and isolation and depression. He behaved very badly with his wife and beat his wife and once drove her out of the house. After retirement, he settled in Kalimpong, completely deserted by all the relations. When his daughter comes to him to stay there in Kalimpong, both of them are uneasy to each other's company. When Sai meets the cook Pannalal, she sees the pathetic condition of Pannalal. Quote, "It seems a long while before they heard a whistle blowing and saw a lantern approaching, and there comes the cook bandy-legged of the path. We were thus and so soiled and he had now, and as he would 10 years later, a poverty-stricken man growing into an ancient as fast forward, compressed childhood, lingering old age, a generation between him and the judge, but you wouldn't know it to look at him. There was age in his temperament, his cattle, his clothes, his kitchen, his voice, his face, in the undisturbed dirt, the undisturbed settled smell of a lifetime of cooking, smoke, kerosene." Unquote. Jemubhai's wife was pregnant when he sent her to India. She delivered a female child. When she comes to India, that was the mother of Sai. Jemubhai was never seen his granddaughter and her parents because he did not like them, and consequently both the granddaughter and grandfather were strangers to each other. Jemubhai likes the Western culture and have the colonial mindset. That is why he likes Sai, because she also likes Western culture and civilization. Quote, "He envied the English. He worked at being English with the passion of hatred, and for what he would become, he would be despised by absolutely everyone, English and Indian both." Unquote. Kiran Desai has created the diasporic character like Biju and Sai. These characters experience displacement and nostalgia in the alien land, so it can be said that memory of the imaginary homeland always haunts the diasporas. Pramod K. Nair has rightly said, exile and displacement narratives frequently combines a sense of disquiet with their nostalgia and longing. Such a migrant does not see the new world as a land of opportunity. Here, Moody also says that the sense of homeless by the recognition that one has not found a new home in the adopted country. Much of diasporic writing explores the theme of an original home. This original home and how lost due their exile is constantly worked into the imagination and myth of the displaced individual or the community. Nostalgia is therefore a key theme in diasporic writing. Unquote. Biju, the son of Panna Lal, confronts the same situation in America, and Jenubhai Patel had faced 50 years ago in England. While watching the scene of TV, Biju come to know about the ground reality of those persons who have left from their customs, culture and civilization. Unquote. A taxi driver appeared on the screen watching bootleg copies of American movies. He had been inspired to come to America, but how to move into mainstreams? He was illegal. His taxi was illegal. The yellow paint was illegal. His whole family was here. And all the men from his village were here, perfectly infiltrated and working within the caste system of the city. But how to get their papers? Would any viewer out there wish to marry him? Even a disabled or mentally retarded green and card holder would be fine. Unquote. The scene is all about a taxi driver who, after watching American luxuries, leaves his country and gets beguiled by a spark of American luxuries, suffered too much in the mainstream and finds himself illegal. Biju compares the situation with the taxi driver appeared on the TV screen. Kiran Desai has given another example which is painting to Biju. Quote, he had been 2 minutes given by committee. Kiran Desai has given very real picture of the place and condition of Biju. A number of insulting events happened with him. He suffers a typical isolation in a foreign country. But the question is very important, which the Kiran Desai has tried to. Jenubhai was terrorized by several absurd questions, like every Indian can ask. Why has he come to a foreign land? What would be the advantage after suffering so much? When shall he be really happy and satisfied? Would there be any pleasure in having been educated in foreign countries, leaving your own native country behind? Why should the foreigners embarrass the Indians? Is it true that Indian culture is inferior to the Western ones? What is ecstasy? Why has he left his dear relatives? Kiran Desai has successfully written this beautiful novel because she has experienced the valleys of Himalayas as well as advanced British culture. The novel is a close analysis of a person who leaves his native land and suffers from fundamental questions of identity and existence. He leaves his native land to earn ample amount of money. But surprisingly, he has to lose so many things instead, like loss of identity, loss of human relations, etc. He consciously preoccupied with the thought of getting success, but unconsciously he is uprooted from his cultural existence. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anshu. The next presentation is by Dr. Deepa Mathur, and she's focusing on the writings of Nazareth, Vasanji and Tijani, and she will spend 3 minutes each on those writers.
Thank you very much, Chair. Well, I'm Deepa Mathur and I'm from the University of Rajasthan, Jaipur. The title of my paper is Diasporic Enclosures in the Writings of Peter Nazareth, Vasanji and Tijani. The recurrent words that I'll be using are miscegenation and secular humanism. It's about East African Asian writers. The work of East African Asian writers thematized, I call, the Asian question while also seeking to destabilize the congealed meanings of being Asian in East Africa. One of the most memorable ways in which an influential set of East African Asian writers attempted to redefine a sense of community was by invoking the controversial figure of the racial half-caste as a sign for Asian identity in the region. The desire to shake off the demands of new particularistic senses of belonging and to distance oneself from the narrow claims of community was particularly strong amongst East African writers of Asian region, burdened as they were with the commonplace charge from the British colonizers and the Africans that their communities were hostile to integration with other racial and cultural groups. As Punitha Rai Salavan has shown in a study of the imaging of Asians in African literature, the diaspora was routinely accused of, I quote, a reckless pursuit of social exclusiveness, unquote, which in turn provided ground for further anti-Asian attitudes and actions. Visiting East Africa in the 1970s, the writer Shiva Nepal, born in Trinidad, where the descendants of Indian indentured laborers had creolized and assimilated, was struck by how, I quote, the Indian and East Africa brought India with him and kept it inviolate, unquote. The tensions that Nepal and Salavan observed in the 1970s can be traced back to an earlier period. In the aftermath of World War II, as anti-colonial agitation intensified, a debate began to emerge about what the future of East Africa might look like and the place of the Indian diaspora in it. Jawaharlal Nehru's High Commissioner to East Africa, at the time Atal Pant, was instrumental in provoking and facilitating the debate. In one enthusiastic moment early in his career, at a public meeting chaired by Jimmu Gichuru, a leader of Kenyan African Union, Pant caused consternation among his Indian audience by stating that, I quote, I would have no objections if my daughter married an African, unquote. Pant was trying to give content to Nehru's call for East African Indians to integrate. Nehru had repeatedly referred to the Indians as guests of the Africans and gone ahead to dissolve the Ministry of Overseas Indians in 1947. Later on, Nehru himself would tell Tom Mboya, a leading nationalist Kenyan politician, that, I quote, we do not even marry each other. Why should we marry non-Indians? The implication of Nehru's repost to Mboya was that although greater integration at a personal or private level might be desirable, it was not the duty of the state to legislate this, especially if the individual's exercise of personal choice did not violate any law. However, if the modern secular state could not practically police conjugal choices without diluting its role as an arbitrator between differing conceptions of the sacred and between different communities, literature was not encumbered by any of this. If the state's attempt to promote the ideal of integration was limited by its recognition of pluralism, the literary imagination had no such boundaries. Miscegenation was to become one of the most important ideas conjured in the imagination as a response to colonial practices of cultural and racial separation. In the 1960s, interracial love and miscegenation was given treatment in the East African writings as diverse as the Black Hermit by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, No Pride Prize by David Rubabiri, and the poetry of Ban Le Yeon. The most sustained treatment that this theme was received, however, has been in the words of the three most influential of the East African Asian writers, Tijani, Nazareth, and Sanji, who have used miscegenation, an idea much derided in colonial discourse, in their attempts to imagine a new post-colonial sense of citizenship. I consider how their deployment of tropes of miscegenation, hybridity, and the half-caste, though arrested in telling ways within the very racial discourse they would have liked to surmount, contained a powerful secular impulse, one that stood in opposition to racialism and its quasi-religious authority. Following Advait Sahib, the idea of the secular is used not merely in its conventional sense to refer to the worldly, but to the particular understanding of social reality as emanating not, I quote, directly from the divine but from an analyzable history made by human beings, unquote. Such a view of the social world as one made by human beings and not simply authorized by nature, tradition and the divine, was especially critical because of the powerful tendency within colonial discourse to naturalize cultural and racial difference, the results of which has heavily divided post-colonial polities. The legal framework set up by the post-colonial states in East Africa attempted to curtail the influence of religious and quasi-religious considerations in public political matters. East African Asian writers went further to explore the ways in which the logic of secularism could invade the private domains that had so far remained inviolate. The understanding, so it would seem, was that the secular experiment at the public level would end up in failure if not accompanied by corresponding shifts within the private domain of people's homes. Indeed, this is something that had occurred of High Commissioner Appapand in the late 1940s. Well, I jump. Given the historical hopes and anxieties ignited by the debate about miscegenation in the post-war years, it is no wonder that East African Asian writers have routinely used the figure of the half-caste, who falls outside strict boundaries of sectarian communities, as a trope of secularism. The half-caste functions in this literature as a trope of culture for culture leveling and equalization, a meeting point against which the self-contained cultural group emerges as an arbitrary construction. If sectarian boundaries has attained a quasi-religious status in the changed atmosphere of colonialism and its aftermath, East African Asian writers explore through their fictions ways in which the breaking of that taboo could contribute to the making of a new secular imagination. If African nationalism tended to see colonial hybridity as a sign of a disabling alienation from an African heritage, East African Asian writers and their like-minded counterparts such as Lo Young and Badri saw in alienation a precondition for freedom. In the scheme these writers said it was not enough that freedom was enshrined in a set of written laws. It had to take an embodied form, hence the focus on miscegenation in a denotative and metaphorical sense. This shortage of time is injustice to paper. I think I'll have to skip a lot. In regard to diasporic East African Asian writing, Bahadur Tejani's Day After Tomorrow is the pioneer novel that has set the standard for the others that have followed. There are at least two senses in which the publication of the novel in 1971 can be considered a seminal moment in East African writing. Firstly, it was the first English language novel by an East African writer. Secondly, it was only the second novel in East Africa after David Rubadri's No Bride Prize to set the issue of African-Asian relations in the region as its center. Drafted mostly in the mid-60s, just before the first mass exodus by the Asians from East Africa in 1968, the novel labors under the border of a society written with racial contradictions and attempts an imaginative resolution to the conflicts it explores. It speculates on the possibility of new human consciousness beyond the restrictions wrought on East Africans by racial and ethnic hostility under colonialism. At the center of the narrative is the protagonist Samsher breaks away from the tradition of his Indian Vyapari community by marrying Unziri, an African nurse, and forsaking a lucrative trading career to become a teacher. In what might seem like a march of self-indulgence, Tejani calls attention to his own remarkable attempt to question the solitude that bedevils cultural communities caught up in their own inwardness. In the novel's epilogue, I quote, "Sometimes I feel that the only people who can appreciate a story like this are the young Americans who are undergoing a temperamental revolution. The revolution of the educated conscience that we in East Africa, marked by our pluralities, have decided to erect the one-form ideal of multiracialism, that is, to keep quiet, to display a deliberate sense of graceful relaxation, which is meant to show non-existence of tension, a civilized orthodoxy against which art must not remain mute," unquote. I jump. Okay. Tejani's celebration of miscegenation controversially recalled 19th century European discourse on race, the critical differences that whereas the half-caste was supposed to represent degeneration in Victorian racial science, in Tejani's hands it comes to represent the kind of vigor that is characteristic of that person who, in the words of one of Tejani's contemporaries, has inherited the best that is from both. That the narrative focuses more on hybridization as a psychological process rather than a cultural one, however, shows just how much the author's ideas are still arrested within the reductive biologism of the Victorians. In an interview with Amy Koshi, Tejani has stated that change and perhaps its inevitable friend, instability, are essential parts of creating living. In taking this view, Tejani has influenced later writers such as Nazareth and Vasanji, whose works are populated with off-castes and outcasts. To be a cultural misfit is to see with a clear eye and with the advantage of a different perspective. To be a cultural half-caste is to occupy a liminal zone from which you understand many cultures without necessarily being immersed in any. For Tejani, the world unleashed by modernity allows an, I quote, imaginative idealism, an open-mindedness, a belief in possibilities, unquote, and, I quote again, sympathy for human effort, unquote, to take root. I know that. Well, I have skipped a lot of part of my paper. I had prepared it on the basis of being 15 minutes given to me, but somehow I don't understand how do I end it, but still I end it. So, as many scholars have noted, exilic or diasporic communities are often caught in a kind of limbo between sites of extraction which still inform their sense of self and the new locations to which they owe an ambivalent affiliation, between the desire to be at the center of powerful narratives and the urge to provide alternative sides of meanings in order to decenter such narratives. Identity in diaspora is transformational for Nazareth, and his figures must also be described as Yuga Mohindi, that is, their goal and Indian identities have already been reformulated by the time of the novel's openings. Yet, as the rumor about the general's birth in a foreign country shows, identification of oneself as a citizen must not become a rejection of others on the basis of their foreignness. For if we look hard enough, everyone is a foreigner. It is upon the recognition of this universal sense of foreignness that Nazareth's secular humanism is built. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Deepa. The next presentation is a dual act, but Dr. Shamina Banu will be presenting on nostalgia and the desire for the homeland.
A very good afternoon to everybody present here. I am Shaminaz from Allahabad. I am presenting a paper which is also co-authored by my friend Dr. Shaista Masih. The title of my paper is Diasporic Sensibility of the South Asian Writers, Nostalgia, Concern for Homeland, or Caching of Emotions. To have lived without even attempting to lay claims to one portion of the earth, to have lived and died as one has been born, unnecessary and accommodative. These words reflect the painful diasporic consciousness of a person who is migrated to a land where he lives but cannot call his own. A remarkable portion of English literature, especially belonging to 20th and 21st century, comprises of diasporic sensibility. Diaspora in 21st century has given way to the new modes of thinking in the field of theory. A brief understanding of diaspora is imperative in the further elaboration of diasporic literature and theory that abounds in a different sort of sensibility. Diaspora has been derived from the Greek word diaspora, that means dispersion. In English language, it refers to the scattering of Jews to the countries outside Palestine after Babylonian captivity. Furthermore, the word expanded in its literal meaning and began to be understood as the migration from one country to another. South Asia, known as the Third World by the Western countries, has seen a large scale of migration of people to USA, UK, Germany, France or other European countries for the sake of professional or academic purposes. The last quarter of 20th century has witnessed a sharp rise in the migration of people from South Asia to the Western world for the up-mentioned reason. Besides, there was also an urge of better option in standard of living. Since literature is the only medium of expression of a personal experience, there has been an abundance of diasporic literature in the past few years. These writers are unable to detach their mind from the land from where they belong. There is a nostalgia in these writers that colors their work. There is also a concern for homeland which they have left behind. The diasporic author engage in cultural transmission that is equitably exchanged in the manner of translating a map of reality for multiple readership. Moreover, they are equipped with bundles of memories and articulate an amalgam of global and national strands that embody the real and imagined experience. In this way, diasporic literature is a major part of contemporary literature because of the global understanding it imparts to the reader. Sometimes it also helps in depicting the genuine problem of any country. It is imagined experience, but the fundamental of this imagination is rooted in reality. Some terms that are usually associated with diaspora are exile, alienation, nostalgia, despair, dislocation, abandonment and disintegration. But at the same time, it is also truth what Ejaz Ahmed opines. He says, diasporic writing are to some extent about the business of finding new angles to enter reality. The distance, geographical and cultural, enables new structure of feeling. The hybridity is subversive. It resists cultural authoritarianism and challenges official truth. In the contemporary scenario, diaspora has become an effective tool of postmodernism by means of which the big voice of master narrative could be challenged. Those living on the margin who feel exiled and alienated from their roots and find no place of their own can effectively discharge their voice. Topographically, South Asia is surrounded by Western Asia, East Asia, Central Asia, Southeastern Asia and Indian Ocean. According to United Nations Geoscheme, they divide the world into region countries that comprise South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, Maldives and Afghanistan. South Asian diaspora is one of the world's largest diaspora. Contemporary South Asian diaspora is mainly voluntary. It is to the countries like Germany, France, USA, UK or other European countries for professional or academic reasons. As explained earlier, it is not the forced one as in 18th and 19th century for indentured labor. South Asian diasporic consciousness, as any other diasporic consciousness, consists of an experience of inadjustment in the new country. Since they do not regard it as their true homeland, there is a feeling of alienation from it. But at the same time, they have a doubt that they are not accepted by their original land and there is an alienation from their land too. The situation for them is like they belong to no place. In a land where one ceases to connect with imparts one loneliness to the immigrant. The difference of culture deepens and so deepens the nostalgia and isolation. In diasporic consciousness, the sense of loss, nostalgia, alienation, isolation, shock are interconnected with each other. They all come from the feeling of disconnection from the new place. The migration are often from the developing countries to the developed countries. South Asian countries are developing countries. The material luxuriates are not in abundance in these countries, while the developed countries offer physical luxuries to a great extent. The difference is not only in terms of physical aspect as infrastructure and lifestyle, but also in terms of social aspect as culture and societal norms. The migrated person could strongly sense this disparity between his native country and the new country. The migration are often from developing countries to developed countries. This brings to him an imbalance or disadjustment that prevent the person from settling down completely. The diasporic writing of South Asia has multiple views of emotions and feelings in it. It is full of feeling of alienation, love and concern for homeland, nostalgia, dispersion and sometimes depression due to dejection, a dual identity with original homeland and adopted country. Identity crisis, search for self in a foreign place, a struggle to save the oneself from being dissolved in the culture of strange people. Besides, there is also a feeling of revolt against discrimination in the adopted country. There are several writers that are venting out their feeling in this way. They wish to let the world know what lie beneath the glossy surface of extravagance that is part of their life. Diasporic writing is also a voice of those living on the margin and who are disposed. Salman Rushdie, who is a Booker Prize winner for his book Midnight Children. His book is an allegory that deals with the history of India from 1910 to the declaration of the emergency in 1976. The story is set in the backdrop of real historical situation and incident. In his famous book Imaginary Homeland, he has discussed the problem faced by the immigrant and the people living in exile, their sense of loss, their urge to reclaim what was lost. Bakshi Sidhwa, a writer from Pakistan, has in his book An American Brat tells the story of a young Pakistani girl between the culture of the East and the West. This is what is called cultural shock, which immigrants from the Oriental world exhibit in the Occidental world. It is no doubt that diasporic writing has given a new dimension to the Indian writing. In fact, it is because of the diasporic Indian writing that literature of India is becoming world famous. Salman Rushdie was the first Indian to receive Booker Prize for his book Midnight Children, Arundhati Roy for her book God of Small Things, Kiran Desai for Inheritance of Loss, and Arvind Adiga for The White Tiger. But the Western world is more interested in the Oriental life rather than the literature. A certain kind of writing is needed to please the readership of the West, and this is quite known to many writers. Lost identity. One of the main traits among immigrants, a long period of distance from their land and a constant mingling with a foreign culture takes away the identity from the immigrant. While the motherland seems to forgetting him, the adopted land is yet suspicious to accept the person unconditionally. There are many writers of the subcontinent who, because of living according to Western taste and expectation, have lost touch of their own country. Example can be given of Bharti Mukherjee, who sees herself now as an American immigrant rather than an expatriate. There are different responses. Okay, I want to conclude my paper. I think that it is no doubt that diasporic Indian writer or writer of the South Asia are making Indian writing in their country's writing more visible through the world. But are they genuinely trying to depict the emotions which are tied to one's own motherland, or they are just sharing their experience for monetary? Thank you.
Thank you, Shaminaz. We got the last paper. That's Dr. Priya Verma was looking at Kanupriya. Okay, she's looking at African woman novelist in the diaspora. And just to assure the audience that I've negotiated a bit of time for questions, so we will allow for some exchange because I think the presenters have taken a lot of effort and they want some good critical feedback on their work.
Okay, thank you, sir. Good afternoon to all of you. My paper is on diasporic vision of Indian and African women novelists. And due to the paucity of time, I'll just deal with Anita Desai of India and Toni Morrison. Okay. Regarding diaspora may be defined as a movement, relocation or displacement of people, a group of people from the native place to another land. The reason for the immigration may be a desire for a better living, for seeking jobs as refugees and many more. Diaspora may be said to be a mixing of different societies and cultures. The immigrant faces the pangs of loneliness, nostalgia, disappointment and identity crisis when in exile in an alien land. The immigrant's condition during exile can well be described in the words of Edward W. Said, where he was that the unhealable rift forced between a human being and a native place, between the self and its true home, its essential sadness can never be surmounted. The diasporic writers themselves face the problem of cultural conflict, caught between the homeland and new home, and so he or she deals with these things of immigration and cultural displacement in their works. Jhumpa Lahiri in her novel, The Namesake, deals with the problem of immigrant and diasporic sensibility by showing the life of Ganguly Bengali family from India. In an interview with India Today, Lahari herself says, "At the heart, the namesake is about parents and children. At the most basic level, this is a story of the family that is coming to grips with who they are and what they are under what circumstances." The novel revolves around the Indian Bengali family of Calcutta, now living in the US. The feeling of being uprooted can be seen in the novel. The desire to remain in touch with their culture, their roots can be seen in Ashoka and Ashima's making friends with Maya, Dilip, Nandi and the Mitras and celebrating Indian festivals. Along with Bengali, their children also learn American culture in order to adjust themselves there. In this connection, Lahari says, "It is almost too perfect a metaphor for the experience of growing up as a child of immigrants, having a divided identity, divided loyalties." Through her novel, The Namesake, Jhumpa Lahari tries to deal with diasporic sensibility and the theme of generation gap, fractured immigrant sensibility, and the problem of adjustment because of two different cultures. Okay, now a bit from Anita Desai. Now, as far as Anita Desai is concerned, Anita Desai, like many of her contemporaries, writes about the feelings and emotions of expatriates. Her novel, Bye Bye Blackbird, deals with the life of Indian immigrants, their homesickness, alienation, rootedness, etc. In this novel, the protagonist Adit thinks about the pros and cons of living in England and his longing for his native country, India. Adit living in England loves the country and praises it, while on the contrary, his friend Dave, who comes to England, hates the country for their invasion and rule over India. But in the end, it is Adit who returns to India while Dave stays behind in England. Comparing India with England, Adit says that in India we only notice the laziness of the clerks and the unpunctuality of buses and trains and the beggars and the flies and the stench of the boredom in it. Ironically, however, it can be seen that he has to face racial discrimination and humiliation there and is called a woke. He has the realization that being as Indian, he cannot attain any high post there. In spite of his love for England, often Adit feels alienated here and longs for his country. Adit's love for India can be seen when he raises funds for his country during India-Pakistan war. Interestingly, he is soon fascinated by the charms of the place, changes his decision to go back to India, forgets his insults and humiliations and joins Adit, while Adit in the end realizes that everything tells you are an outsider and not entitled to the country. R.S. Sharma comments thus, "The novel is about the alienation of the immigrant in a world which is alluring and appalling at the same time." Okay, just a few minutes on Indian African diaspora. Now, as far as the African diaspora is concerned, the African diaspora was the movement of Africans and the descendants to the places throughout the world, predominantly to the Americans and to Europe. The African Union defined the African diaspora as of people of African origin living outside the continent and building of the African Union. The work of black women writers like Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, etc. is based on research into African American thought and experience. In her novel, Tar Baby portrays the intricate complex of being black. Through her representation of the paradoxical Tar Baby identity, Morrison explores the ways in which the black subject grapples with the allure of capitalist values, the seduction of white culture, and the legacy of an African heritage. The dilemma facing the dream driver, trauma-ridden protagonist Dedine, Child demonstrates the perilous status of black people and their struggle with what W.B. calls the double consciousness of black folk in the quest for a self-identity and authenticity. In the process of reconstructing their individual and cultural identity, black subjects must experience and confront the pathological disturbances caused by ideological fantasy and the burden of racial trauma. I'll just sum up. So with the help of these 2 or 3 Indian and African women novelists, I just want to say that as far as the African women writers are concerned, and especially Toni Morrison, she tries to raise a few points through her novels, like what diaspora really means. Then can racial unity offer a clear alternative to Western oppression? Can a unified diasporic identity counter modernity that delineates and fragments? I'll just sum up. So through these Indian and African diasporic writers, they have tried to delve deep into the psyche of the immigrants and their life in the alien land, and what they have retained about the native place and also the positive and the negative aspects of the foreign lands. Thank you.
Thanks, Priya. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Prof. Malti Mathur, as discussant. I'm reliably informed that she's read all the novels, seen all the movies and plays discussed here.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Well, we've been talking about diaspora, and there is a lot of the real and the imagined reality that we always associate with the diaspora. And I'm fully aware that I'm conferring a kind of status of victimhood upon all of you, because you are getting increasingly alienated from the reality of this conference, and I think feeling an increasing affinity to the imagined aroma of food emanating from the guest house. It's too far away, but I think you're getting there through your imagination. And my colleague here made sure in true diasporic fashion, saying things that were there in his mind but not really saying it, by bringing attention to the fact that he's only man here in the panel, and secretly trying to disguise his delight at being so. Well, to come back to serious matters, it's been a very informative session, and I think that the kind of perspectives that we've been offered, especially with view to the diasporic perspective in Bollywood films, I think that's very interesting, because most of the movie films that we see which feature the diaspora are very romanticized, idealized perspectives, especially of the Indian situation. And some of them, like Swadesh, which was discussed in quite great detail, talks about the point of view of the revenant, the wanderer who comes back and looks at his hometown or his home country with a completely fresh perspective, which was very interesting. But I think that one of the most important points that were raised only marginally was the fractured identity of the diasporic writers. I think identity is a fluid and shifting thing. We are so many things at one and the same time. And as diasporic writers, I think they inhabit a very crucial crossroads in history, for it is up to them to articulate this fractured identity of their contemporaries and of the compatriots. And as such, I think diasporic writing, diasporic filmmaking, artists of all hues and all personations, I think are so important in articulating this kind of identity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Malti. I think Swadesh raised a very interesting issue about caste. I also recall this image of the screen, the upper caste on one side and lower caste on the other, and this new person had to try to bring them together. I think the other issue is Pardes. There's a dark underbelly of the diaspora, where this, mail order bride comes in and the son wants to marry an American woman, etc. And those things need to be discussed in more detail. But I'll open the floor now for questions. We've got about 10 minutes. I see a couple of hands and I can't see very clearly. Someone with the mic, please. Please be brief with questions, and I'm sure we'll follow up during lunch. Just choose in the front here.
Do we start with negotiate, please?
Thanks, Chair, or should I say the thorn amongst the roses. Comments, not questions. First, on the issue of Hindi cinema. I agree totally with what has been said, but I noticed that you really focus on the more recent movies. And what I could tell you is from the experience of an Indian in Trinidad, right, part of the diaspora, is that those movies were and still are our link to India. And while you talk about the more recent ones, we could actually take you all the way back 50 years ago to where our only contact and our only view of India would have come from Hindi cinema, from Bollywood. From the first black and white movie, Bala Jogan, all the way to Mother India, to the movies of Amitabh, which were always sold out, to the present day, where we actually now have Hindi movies being produced on location in Trinidad. So it has come full circle. And what I would do is actually, would invite you to come to see how Bollywood has actually infused itself into the lives of Indians in Trinidad today. Because one of the things you also need to bear in mind is that we lost the language, but we never lost that particular affinity. And strange enough, we don't speak Hindi, but in Trinidad on a per capita basis, we have more Indian singers than anywhere else in the world. We have more Indian orchestras than anywhere else in the world, and they now play to pack audiences in North America. So that's the comment on the Hindi cinema. For Nandini Sen on Sea of Poppies, that description of the journey is, very similar to what our forefathers would have experienced crossing the Kalapani. Different castes, you entered the boat, different castes, you came out as Jahaji Bai. And what I find interesting is the notion of, again, the fractured identity of the writers, in that reminds me of a lot of the work of V.S. Naipaul, Nobel Prize winner in literature, and part of the Indian diaspora, and also some of the work of his nephew, Shiva Naipaul. So I think in terms of carrying your research forward, it would be, how do you compare and contrast the fractured identities of the diaspora writers in terms of how they see that particular message being played out?
Thanks, Rola. I think I could put ditto Durban, and it would be the same comment. There are two, one Gen Chair. We'll allow you to respond to the end. I will take if there's 3 hands up, there's 1, 2, 3, and then we ask for responses. I think I will call it a close after that. Yeah, Mr. Jwala Rangwaran is from Trinidad. He was the person that asked the question. Others, please tell us who you are.
Yeah, R.P. Pradhan. I presented a paper on Diaspora Economics Connect, Financial Connect yesterday. It was fascinating imagination, loaded with words and expressions, very interesting. One observation I would like to make here is that in the process of communicating ourselves or the issues connected with the diaspora, both at the homeland, also at the outside world, in the process, are we creating a landscape of which can be described in the following words, that we are in the process, we are Indianizing Europe and Westernizing South Asia. That's for the film critics to respond to. One small question to Lena on the Iranian diaspora. The conflict of Iranian identity in the global politics. That's, for the last 30 years, rather one would imagine is that Iran is in a state of conflict, both in a larger way and internally also. Is that somewhere being reflected in the diaspora community outside the world? And is it also an extension of Muslim diaspora, or Iran diaspora is something slightly different than the rest of the Islamic diaspora that is visible? Thank you.
Okay, just two colleagues here, one right in front. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to be very brief, and I'll also talk very fast. What I seem to see in the conference, for example, is we're looking at diaspora from different domains and with different interests. Some are, economic, some are policy issues, and etc. Film and all the cultural. I'm coming from the cultural dimension of things. And earlier on, I asked the question: Is migration, is out-migration positive or not? The answer was, it's not. I say it is. Just listen to this. It is negative. From the viewpoint of what has been said from films and all that, I have a stock of phrases and words that I want to read to you here, and you tell me whether this is positive or negative. People in the diaspora, they face racial discrimination. They long for their home countries. They are nostalgic. There is loneliness. There is an identity crisis. There is sadness. There is cultural conflict. There is displacement. There is humiliation. There is homesickness. There is longing. They are cut between the host nation and the home nation. There is divided identity, etc., etc. If I say, is this positive or negative, what would you say? Also, they face alienation. Then the last thing, Nandini, Dr. Nandini, my sister there, culture, concerning culture. I have no problems, for example, with cultural evolution, but I have serious problems with cultural revolution. That causes alienation and all that. And this is what I was saying about Zimbabwe. Those guys, they are facing a cultural revolution, and they don't have the heavy duty shock absorbers to absorb the cultural shock. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Prof. Paramjit, the last comment, very brief, and I'll ask the panelists to respond.
I think I'm more or less following on his presentation remarks. First is that how truly is the Bollywood reflective of the Indian culture? When you call of diversity in the Indian culture, then how have we taken your saying that Indian cinema is very popular abroad? How far we are able to reach to the others, if we call them the others, beyond the Indian diaspora? And then finally, has it helped in bringing connectivity between the diaspora and the host countries?
Okay, I'm going to be generous. Prof. Mia has been our special guest, and it's pretty one up. 1 minute, Prof. Mia.
Well, it will be less than 1 minute. I'm going to comment on the fractured identity. There are a lot of diasporic doctors around the world, and they can do great surgery for fractured identity.
Okay, I'm going to just go to the panelists from the right. I'm actually on the left, so I'll start from the left. Please respond to any comment you think. Please respond.
Now, as far as the culture is concerned, what I personally feel is every culture or every society has its pros and cons. So what we can do is just imbibe the positive things and leave out the negative. This is what I want to say.
Thank you all for your comments. Now, I would like to answer each one of you separately. My friend from Trinidad, your point is absolutely well taken, because it's not as if one has not read Naipaul and one is not engaged with him. But in this particular case, because I was basing my work entirely on Ghosh and I did not wish to look at the Trinidadian experience, the Trinidadian and the Mauritian experience have a lot in common. So the connect that you're talking with Bollywood is there as much in Mauritius as there is in Trinidad. And also interestingly, in Trinidad you have this celebration of India Day, the first day that the indentured labour stepped onto Trinidad, which is sort of exemplary, because nowhere in the world has this event is followed. So and the other thing is my research. this I wouldn't even call it my research. This particular paper is on Ghosh. And Ghosh thankfully does not look at himself as a diasporic writer. He's very rooted where he is, and he likes to observe the world from there. So that is why the inclusion of Naipaul and such like have not happened. But otherwise your point is very definitely well taken, that one needs to look at fractured identities from the diasporic writer's point of view. Our friend from Zimbabwe, we had this discussion yesterday also. I completely understand your concerns when you're talking about the cultural rupture that is happening in Zimbabwe. The cultural formation that I was talking about, which starts off in, say, Trinidad and which starts off in Mauritius, is a different story altogether. You know, it's like a formation of a society and things coming together. What you were talking about, and I think it's a continuation of the same debate, when you talk about families being sort of rendered to certain problems because the husband has gone out to work and so on and so forth. And I did mention then, and I don't know whether you really understood at that point of time, because it's a very typical Indian thing that happens. It's not only diaspora that we are talking about. I mean, I couldn't touch upon these issues in my paper, but this whole Bidesiya culture that I'm talking about actually mourns the movement of their men to Calcutta from Bihar. And that is a rupture. So when we are talking about diasporic identities, one also needs to understand that there are diasporas within diaspora. So it's not just the Kalapani, and it's not just, and the song, in fact, that one of the songs that I was talking about, and the entire, literatures have come from this mourning of the women who feel they have lost their men to the Harijans in Calcutta, who've sort of made lambs out of their men. So, and this is within the same country. So one needs to understand that also. And so I think your question kind of links up with that. So that's it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jwala. I think what you were saying, the older films, that was the start point of what I had to actually jump across and come to 90s, looking at the time. But surely we all remember Raj Kapoor saying Juta Meja Pani and Patlu Hindustani, Prabhi Dil Hindustani. So I mean, starting from there, and then I think somewhere I did mention about how initially NRIs were portrayed and how there was, the link was not that strong. Your point, of course, I would incorporate, but then the link was where they were projected very negative, and there's a shift now where they are being projected very nice, helpful, wealthy, people who can be imitated, etc. So that kind of shift, and of course, it is older films are the ones where actually this whole thing has started off. Surely, as you say that the language lost but affinity stays, is what even I am trying to look at, that whether it's your language or not, but there is some connect with the homeland and there is a sense of nostalgia. I think Dr. Francis, if I can just, I don't know, directly linked with the films or not, but I still feel there cannot be negative or positive responses to what you're saying. I mean, there can be one school of thought saying no, and the other saying yes. There can be conflicts, and there can be a new identity which within staying in the other land, one does develop a new identity and one feels very close to it as well. And finally, sir, in the end, culture is what is constructed, and it is constructed around what I feel is the target audience. Whom are we going to serve to? And when you ask him whom we are going to serve to, or is it reaching the masses, or is it reaching actually the people that one is talking about, I feel that it's one of the agencies. I mean, whether it's reaching few or not, but it has a great influence, and it surely, if one looks at the shifts that are taking place within the cinema, and it's a two-sided process. I mean, if diaspora is getting affected is one, it's also the films who are now encashing on this whole phenomena of depicting the, NRIs and how they are depicting. There is this whole content which is getting changed, and also how it is being received is also something to be analyzed. So I think, thank you.
Well, I also fully agree with Dr. Vishwa Rakshaji, what she said about the films, because of the lack of paucity of time, and we have to straight jump to the 90s and 2010 era and have to give the projection of the movies. We really find that identity loss, identity crisis, and how we can save. So this is one thing. Apart from that, what I realize is that it is the culture which unites us, as well as it is the culture which also disunites us. And coming to this point, I would say the question raised by Mr. Francis, that whether the questions of racial discrimination or cultural conflicts, can you directly say negative or positive? Well, I will say, is there any such escape route? I don't think so. We are all within this route. We are actually, we are not making it separated or like united. We are all trying to bridge a gap, and that is what I think this number of people, 80-90 people, is what we have united here from different parts of the world with different culture. But today we have become one culture, and that is the culture of diaspora. And diaspora of culture, identity, migration, whatever you say, it is our diasporic notion that we are today here united and discussing that whether really there is an escape route. If I had to comment, I will say no. We are really happy that if it is negative, then we are all united here and sitting together. Then it's better that there should never emerge any such concept which we can say yes or no. We should be within this, and that's what again and again we will come here and unite together, and we will be focusing on different other aspects. Thank you.
Thank you to all the comments. I will just answer quickly the question about the Iranian diaspora. There are similarities to other Muslim communities or films concerning issues of identity or themes like nostalgia, longing, the connection to the homeland. But it has to be said that the Iranian diaspora is a political one and has a more exilic character. So the whole issue of being outside is always is more problematic than, for example, for Turkish guest worker diaspora in Germany or Austria, for example, who are going every summer back to Turkey, or even Indian diaspora, where there is a flow back and forth, which is not possible for the Iranian diaspora. And to the question if it's a gain or a loss, I would always say that multiculturalism is always a gain. So, thank you.
Before we hand over to our coordinator, these 3 comments came from a member of the audience, and I think it's a male because he didn't put his name. But it's comments worthy for consideration, and it's titled Failure of Homogenization. 1. What are the cultural implications of diasporic contestation for space, identity, culture in your respective works? Is diasporization a loss or gain? Can we base our judgment on the conditions under which exit takes place, on the conditions, extent of integration and acceptability in host communities? And the final comment, how does diasporization create citizens and subjects as well as subalternities in host societies? I think it will help advance the work. I think there were 10 papers, and I know organizers are talking about negotiation with publishers. I think these 10 essays can go into one solid publication. And I've been responsible for some rough cheering, so to compensate, I'm inviting members of the panel to lunch.
My final words. Thank you, Professor Krish Maharaj, for conducting the session so well. We don't think this was rough at all. And I'm so glad you actually negotiated this time, because it actually brought in a lot of insight. Professor, you don't want me to repeat what I just said, right? So I'll go ahead. Thank you to Professor Malti Mathur for her valuable remarks and for the little prank she played on Professor Krish Maharaj. And thank you, presenters, for enriching us from insights from both the film, theatre and the diasporic writings. We have our lunch waiting for us. Though we have delayed this session, I please request you all to try and be back by 2:15, 2:20. And just a food for thought, I can't contain myself, because we're talking about culture and cultural identity crisis. I spent my entire life in Kathmandu, that is where I was born and brought up. And my father wanted to come back to the roots in India. And after 16 years of my childhood in Kathmandu, I actually felt cultural identity crisis coming back to India. Where, I mean, in Nepal, I was forcibly, given doses of Indian culture, because my father had this huge fear that my children are not becoming enough Indians. But when we came back to India, I think the Indian society had evolved far more than what he had thought, and culture is evolving. Society is dynamic. So when we talk about cultural crisis, I think we need to take it in the contemporary context. Thank you.